Laura Bennett discovered the truth about Mahmoud El Sayed's systematic deception on September 12, 2023, at 3:47 in the afternoon Cairo time, when she arrived unannounced at his apartment building in the Nazar City district, hoping to surprise the man she believed was her fiancé with an early arrival before their planned meeting the following day, only to find another Western woman answering his door, wearing an engagement ring identical to the one Mahmoud had given Laura during their supposedly exclusive romantic relationship that she had believed represented genuine love and commitment, rather than recognizing it as calculated fraud perpetrated by someone who maintained simultaneous romantic relationships with at least 4 different women across 3 countries, while extracting tens of thousands of pounds from each through carefully calibrated emotional manipulation and exploitation of their loneliness, hope, and desperate desire for connection and validation after divorces or relationship failures that had left them vulnerable to predators who understood exactly which psychological buttons to press to make intelligent, educated women suspend their critical judgment in service of believing they had finally found the soulmate connection they had been seeking. The confrontation that followed this devastating discovery revealed not only Sandra Muller, a 50-year-old German woman who had also been flying to Cairo regularly to see Mahmoud and who had also spent enormous sums on travel, gifts, and contributions to fabricated emergencies that Mahmoud claimed required financial assistance, but also the existence of at least 2 other foreign women and 1 local Egyptian fiancé who were all simultaneously engaged to the same man who had constructed elaborate lies about his life circumstances, his feelings, and his intentions toward each woman he targeted through sophisticated understanding of how lonely, middle-aged, divorced women could be manipulated through precisely calibrated romantic attention and promises of extraordinary connection that felt more authentic than any previous relationship they had experienced. The shock of recognition between Laura and Sandra, as they realized they had both been systematically deceived by someone who had professed eternal love and exclusive devotion to each of them, was compounded by Mahmoud's reaction when he arrived home to find his 2 foreign fiancés comparing notes about his deception, displaying not remorse or shame but rather cold calculation about how to minimize the damage to his ongoing schemes, and threatening both women with consequences if they attempted to report his behavior to authorities or warn other potential victims about his predatory patterns. The relationship between Laura Bennett and Mahmoud El Sayed had begun 26 months earlier in July 2021 through a Facebook group focused on Egyptian travel and culture, where Laura had been posting questions about planning her first solo trip to Cairo and Luxor, following her divorce after 22 years of marriage, to a man who had gradually become emotionally distant and critical in ways that had eroded her confidence and left her feeling invisible and unappreciated. Mahmoud had responded to Laura's posts with friendly, helpful information about Egyptian customs and recommended sites, gradually transitioning from public comments to private messages that demonstrated apparent interest in her as a person, rather than merely as a tourist seeking travel advice, asking thoughtful questions about her life, her interests, and her emotional state in ways that made her feel genuinely seen and valued for the first time in years. The escalation from friendly online contact to explicit romantic interest occurred gradually over several weeks, as Mahmoud employed classic grooming tactics, including excessive praise for Laura's appearance and personality based on her Facebook photos, disclosure of his own supposed loneliness and desire for meaningful connection with someone who shared his values, and carefully timed expressions of growing feelings that made Laura feel she was experiencing rare, extraordinary connection, rather than recognizing it as calculated manipulation designed to create emotional dependency that could be exploited financially and psychologically. Mahmoud presented himself as educated hotel professional who spoke multiple languages and dreamed of eventually leaving Egypt to build a life somewhere, offering more opportunities, subtly suggesting that meeting the right partner might make such dreams possible, while never explicitly asking for money or making demands that might trigger Laura's defenses or cause her to recognize the predatory nature of his interest. The first trip Laura made to Egypt in October 2021 was framed as adventure travel, with the added bonus of meeting her online friend in person to see if their digital chemistry would translate to real-world connection. though by the time she boarded her flight from Manchester, Laura had already invested enormous emotional energy in believing Mahmoud represented potential for the kind of passionate, devoted relationship she had never experienced during her practical, but ultimately unfulfilling marriage. The week Laura spent in Cairo during that first visit exceeded all her romantic fantasies, as Mahmoud orchestrated perfectly choreographed experiences, including sunset, felucca rides on the Nile, private tours of historical sites where he shared carefully researched information, demonstrating his supposed education and sophistication, and intimate conversations, where he professed feelings so intense and specific that Laura became convinced she had finally found her soulmate, despite the obvious practical obstacles, including their 16-year age difference, their vastly different cultural backgrounds, and the geographical distance that would make sustaining any genuine relationship extraordinarily challenging. The financial exploitation that characterized Mahmoud's relationship with Laura began subtly during her second visit in January 2022, when he mentioned family emergencies requiring temporary financial assistance that he would of course repay once his next paycheck arrived, presenting these requests in ways that made refusing seem heartless and suspicious of his intentions, rather than recognizing them as classic scam tactics designed to establish a pattern of financial extraction while testing how much money Laura could be manipulated into providing. The amounts Mahmoud requested escalated gradually from a few £100s to cover his mother's supposed medical treatment to several £1,000s for emergency repairs to his family's apartment that he claimed were necessary before they could properly host Laura during future visits. Each request accompanied by elaborate emotional manipulation about how their future together depended on overcoming these temporary obstacles through mutual support and sacrifice. The engagement that Mahmoud orchestrated during Laura's third visit in May 2022 was presented as spontaneous romantic gesture, though it was actually carefully calculated step in his long-term extraction strategy, with the ring he purchased using Laura's own money presented as symbol of his commitment, while actually functioning to deepen her psychological investment and make her less likely to question subsequent financial requests or to recognize warning signs that might indicate his professed love was systematic deception. The engagement gave Mahmoud leverage to frame his escalating financial demands as reasonable requests from a fiancé preparing to build their shared future, rather than transparent exploitation by someone who had no intention of actually marrying Laura or any of his other victims, but who understood that maintaining the illusion of commitment was essential for sustaining the flow of money and gifts that constituted his actual income. The isolation that Mahmoud systematically imposed on Laura included subtle discouragement of her friendships with people who expressed skepticism about their relationship, criticism of family members who questioned whether someone she had known for such a short time could genuinely be planning a future with her, and demands that she prove her devotion by prioritizing their relationship over concerns raised by people who supposedly could not understand the extraordinary connection they shared. This isolation served multiple purposes, including reducing the likelihood that Laura would be exposed to contrary opinions that might undermine Mahmoud's manipulation, and ensuring that she had fewer sources of emotional and financial support that might enable her to escape his control once she began recognizing the exploitation. The warning signs that Laura's best friend Emily noticed during the 2 years of Laura's relationship with Mahmoud included dramatic personality changes where Laura became secretive and defensive about her finances, emotional volatility, where she cycled between euphoric descriptions of her perfect relationship and tearful admissions that she felt confused and exhausted, and concerning patterns where every visit to Egypt seemed to coincide with new emergencies, requiring additional money, despite Mahmoud's claims of stable employment and imminent financial improvements that would allow him to begin repaying the enormous sums Laura had already provided. Emily's attempts to encourage Laura to investigate Mahmoud's background, or to at least slow down the relationship, were dismissed as jealousy or failure to understand true love, reflecting how effectively Mahmoud had manipulated Laura into viewing skepticism from concerned friends as threats to be rejected rather than legitimate warnings deserving serious consideration. The financial devastation that Laura experienced through her relationship with Mahmoud El Sayed totaled over £40,000 across the 26 months between their initial contact and the discovery of his multiple simultaneous engagements, representing her entire divorce settlement, most of her savings, and substantial credit card debt she had accumulated to fund the travel, gifts, and supposed emergency assistance that Mahmoud had systematically extracted through precisely calibrated emotional manipulation. The accounting that Laura would eventually compile with Emily's assistance revealed that beyond the 6 flights to Cairo and the accommodation costs, she had transferred money for his mother's fabricated medical treatments, his sister's fake education expenses, emergency car repairs for a vehicle he did not actually own, visa application fees for immigration processes that were never actually initiated, and dozens of smaller amounts requested for everyday expenses that Mahmoud claimed would be temporary until his financial situation improved, as he had been promising since the beginning of their relationship. The discovery that shattered Laura's belief in Mahmoud's authenticity occurred when she decided to surprise him by arriving in Cairo one day earlier than their scheduled meeting, hoping to create a romantic, spontaneous moment that would demonstrate her devotion and perhaps accelerate the wedding plans they had supposedly been working toward for over a year. The taxi ride from Cairo International Airport to Mahmoud's apartment building in Nasser City took 47 minutes through chaotic traffic, with Laura rehearsing in her mind the expression she imagined would cross Mahmoud's face when she appeared unexpectedly at his door, completely unprepared for the actual scene that would greet her when a confused European woman answered his apartment door, wearing an engagement ring and casual clothing, suggesting comfortable familiarity with the space Laura had been told was exclusively Mahmoud's private residence. The initial confusion between Laura and Sandra Mueller lasted only moments before recognition dawned that they were both engaged to the same man, with Sandra having flown from Frankfurt that morning for her own scheduled visit with Mahmoud, who had apparently not anticipated that his careful scheduling of his multiple fiancés' visits would fail catastrophically when Laura changed her plans without informing him of her earlier arrival. The conversation that followed between the two women revealed striking similarities in their experiences, including the romantic story of how they had met through online platforms related to Egyptian travel, the intense courtship involving daily video calls and elaborate expressions of devotion, the engagement rings purchased during emotional ceremonies at romantic Cairo locations, and the ongoing requests for financial assistance to address emergencies that seemed to perpetually prevent Mahmoud from achieving the financial stability he constantly promised was imminent. The comparison of their respective financial contributions revealed that Sandra had provided approximately 35,000 euros over 18 months, amounts similar to Laura's expenditures, though Sandra's relationship with Mahmoud had begun 6 months after his initial contact with Laura, indicating he had been running multiple concurrent scams rather than sequentially moving between victims. The realization that they were not Mahmoud's only victims, but rather part of a systematic operation targeting multiple women simultaneously transformed their initial shock and embarrassment into determination to understand the full scope of his deception and to prevent him from continuing to exploit other vulnerable women through the same sophisticated manipulation tactics. The confrontation when Mahmoud arrived at his apartment at 6:32 that evening, expecting to find only Sandra, and instead discovering both of his foreign fiancés, comparing notes about his deception, revealed a man whose charming romantic persona evaporated instantly to expose cold, calculating predator who felt no genuine remorse about the harm he had inflicted, but only concern about how to minimize damage to his ongoing schemes. Mahmoud's initial strategy was to attempt to manipulate each woman individually by claiming the other was delusional or lying, but the detailed evidence Laura and Sandra had compiled during their afternoon together made such claims transparently false and forced Mahmoud to shift to threats about how reporting him to authorities would be pointless because he had connections that would ensure nothing came of their complaints and would only result in embarrassment for them as foreign women who had been naive enough to believe an Egyptian man's romantic promises. The threatening behavior that Mahmoud displayed when he realized his manipulation tactics were failing included blocking the apartment door to prevent Laura and Sandra from leaving, raising his voice in ways designed to intimidate them into compliance, and making explicit statements that they would regret any attempts to expose him or interfere with his life. The threats were sufficiently concerning that Laura documented them through voice recording on her phone, evidence that would later prove crucial for establishing Mahmoud's consciousness of guilt and his pattern of using intimidation to silence victims who discovered his deception and threatened to report his systematic fraud to authorities who might actually investigate, despite his claims of having protective connections. The escape from Mahmoud's apartment occurred when Sandra took advantage of a moment when he was focused on arguing with Laura to open the door, and both women fled to the street where they hailed a taxi to take them to Sandra's hotel in the more tourist-oriented area of Cairo, where they felt safer from potential retaliation. The remainder of that evening was spent sharing documentation of their respective relationships with Mahmoud, discovering through their text message histories and financial records that he had been maintaining carefully segregated communications where each woman believed she was his exclusive romantic interest, while he was simultaneously conducting identical relationships with multiple victims, using remarkably similar scripts and manipulation tactics across all his targets. The decision to report Mahmoud to Egyptian authorities was complicated by concerns about whether the police would take their complaints seriously, given cultural attitudes that sometimes blamed foreign women for romantic and financial entanglements with local men. But Laura and Sandra determined that remaining silent would only enable Mahmoud to continue exploiting other vulnerable women who might not be as fortunate to discover his deception before losing even more money or becoming entangled in more dangerous situations. The initial police report filed at the local precinct on September 13th was received with skepticism by officers who seemed to view the situation as foolish tourists who had made poor romantic choices rather than recognizing it as systematic fraud requiring criminal investigation. Though the detailed financial documentation and evidence of multiple simultaneous victims eventually prompted assignment of the case to Detective Karim Yusuf, who specialized in fraud investigations and who had encountered similar romance scam patterns in previous cases. The investigation that Detective Yusuf initiated revealed that Mahmoud El-Sayed was far more prolific than even Laura and Sandra had realized, with evidence documenting at least 7 foreign women who had been engaged to him simultaneously or sequentially over a 4-year period, along with one local Egyptian woman whose family had been planning an actual wedding before discovering Mahmoud's multiple foreign relationships and canceling the marriage arrangements. The financial records showed that Mahmoud had extracted hundreds of thousands of pounds, equivalent across all his victims, with some women having provided even more substantial amounts than Laura's £40,000, representing in many cases their entire life savings or forcing them into significant debt that would take years to repay. The psychological profile developed through investigation revealed Mahmoud as classic romance scammer who targeted specific demographic of middle-aged divorced women from Western countries who were financially stable, emotionally vulnerable, following relationship failures, and susceptible to manipulation through promises of passionate romantic connection and exotic cultural experiences. The tactical sophistication Mahmoud demonstrated included maintaining detailed notes about each victim's preferences, fears, and financial capacity, customizing his emotional manipulation to exploit each woman's specific vulnerabilities, and carefully scheduling visits to prevent his multiple fiancés from discovering each other while maintaining the illusion of exclusive devotion to each woman he was systematically exploiting. The discovery of Mahmoud's documentation of his scams, including spreadsheets, tracking each victim's financial contributions and calendars, coordinating their visits, revealed consciousness of guilt and deliberate systematic fraud, rather than simply being a man who had made mistakes in managing multiple relationships. The evidence showed someone who viewed women purely instrumentally as sources of income, to be exploited through whatever emotional manipulation proved most effective, with no apparent capacity for empathy or concern about the devastating financial and psychological harm he was inflicting on women who had trusted him with their hopes, their savings, and their vulnerable emotional states following previous relationship traumas. The expansion of the investigation beyond Laura and Sandra revealed the true scope of Mahmoud El-Sayed's romance scam operation when Detective Yusuf contacted Interpol and European police agencies to identify additional victims who might have filed reports in their home countries without realizing their experiences were part of larger criminal pattern. The international cooperation revealed at least 5 additional women from Britain, Germany, France, Netherlands, and Sweden who had all been engaged to Mahmoud during overlapping time periods, with each woman having traveled to Egypt multiple times and having provided substantial financial support for fabricated emergencies and supposed wedding preparations that never materialized into actual marriages despite years of promises and elaborate planning discussions. The pattern that emerged from comparing all victims' experiences showed remarkable consistency in Mahmoud's methods, including initial contact through social media platforms related to Egyptian culture or travel, gradual escalation from friendly information sharing to romantic interest over several weeks, intense courtship phase involving daily video calls and elaborate expressions of devotion, relatively quick progression to engagement during victims' first or second visit to Egypt, and systematic extraction of money through carefully calibrated requests for emergency assistance that tested and gradually expanded each victim's willingness to provide financial support. The consistency of the pattern across multiple victims over several years demonstrated that Mahmoud had refined his techniques through experience and that he understood exactly how to exploit specific psychological vulnerabilities common among his target demographic. The testimony from victims revealed devastating psychological impact, extending far beyond the financial losses, with women describing profound shame about being deceived, difficulty trusting anyone in subsequent relationships, depression and anxiety requiring professional treatment, and social isolation resulting from embarrassment about having fallen for romance scam that friends and family had sometimes warned against. The psychological harm was compounded by cultural attitudes that sometimes blamed victims for being naive or greedy, rather than recognizing them as targets of sophisticated predatory behavior designed specifically to exploit normal human desires for love and connection that became weaponized by someone who understood exactly how to manipulate vulnerable individuals. The investigation into Mahmoud's local Egyptian fiancée, Amira Hassan, revealed perhaps the most tragic dimension of his systematic deception, as she had been the only relationship where actual wedding plans were progressing with family, involvement, and genuine cultural ceremonies, only to have everything collapse when her relatives discovered his multiple foreign fiancés and realized that Mahmoud had been using his engagement to Amira as cover for his romance scam operations by presenting himself to foreign women as single, while actually maintaining traditional engagement to local women whose family expected marriage. The humiliation Amira experienced when the truth emerged about Mahmoud's behavior destroyed her reputation in conservative cultural context, where her association with someone conducting romance scams with foreign women reflected poorly on her family's judgment and her own character, regardless of her complete innocence and victimization. The financial investigation revealed that Mahmoud had been living entirely from the money he extracted from his foreign victims, with his declared income from hotel reception work being minimal and insufficient to support the lifestyle he projected through social media and during his victims' visits to Cairo. The bank records showed regular deposits from international wire transfers and periodic large cash deposits that coincided with his victims' visits when they provided money directly, with the funds being spent on maintaining his apartment, purchasing clothing and accessories necessary for projecting successful image, and supporting family members who may or may not have been aware of the criminal source of Mahmoud's apparent financial success. The discovery of WhatsApp groups where Mahmoud and other Egyptian men shared tactics for romance scamming foreign women revealed that his operation was not isolated, but rather part of broader informal network where scammers exchanged information about effective manipulation techniques, warned each other about victims who had become suspicious or reported them to authorities, and sometimes even traded contact information for women who had visited Egypt and might be vulnerable to romance scam approaches. The group chat histories revealed disturbing callousness about the harm being inflicted on victims who were discussed in dehumanizing terms as sources of income rather than as individuals deserving basic respect and honesty. The legal proceedings against Mahmoud in Egyptian courts faced complications due to ambiguities in laws that did not explicitly address romance scams and cultural factors that sometimes made authorities hesitant to aggressively prosecute cases where foreign women had voluntarily provided money to Egyptian men they were romantically involved with, even when the deception and systematic fraud were clearly documented. The prosecutors who took on the case argued that Mahmoud's behavior constituted fraud through deliberate misrepresentation of his intentions and his relationship status, and that the systematic nature of his operations across multiple victims demonstrated criminal enterprise rather than simply failed relationships between consenting adults who had different expectations. The testimony from Dr. Nadia Hassan, a Cairo psychologist who specialized in counseling victims of romance fraud, provided expert context about the psychological manipulation tactics Mahmoud had employed and the particular vulnerabilities of middle-aged divorced women from Western countries who represented his target demographic. Dr. Hassan explained that victims should not be blamed for falling for sophisticated manipulation techniques, specifically designed to bypass rational judgment by exploiting emotional needs and desires for connection that were universal human experiences, rather than indicating character flaws or intellectual deficiencies in the women who had been targeted. The media coverage of the case, in both Egyptian and European outlets, brought widespread attention to romance scam phenomenon and the particular risks faced by Western women traveling to Egypt or engaging with Egyptian men through online platforms, though the coverage sometimes fell into victim-blaming narratives that suggested women should have known better, rather than focusing on the criminal responsibility of perpetrators who deliberately deceived vulnerable individuals. The more thoughtful coverage emphasized how sophisticated modern romance scams had become and how even intelligent, educated women could be manipulated by predators who understood exactly which psychological buttons to press to make their targets suspend critical judgment in service of believing they had found genuine, extraordinary connection. The victim support networks that emerged during the investigation provided Laura and the other women with crucial emotional assistance and validation that helped counter the shame and self-blame that romance scam victims typically experienced. The connection with other women who had been targeted by Mahmoud helped Laura understand that her victimization reflected his sophisticated predatory behavior rather than any deficiency in her judgment or character. Though the process of accepting this reality and working through the grief about the relationship she had believed was real remained lengthy and psychologically challenging, despite the rational understanding that Mahmoud had never genuinely cared for her. The financial recovery efforts faced significant obstacles, as Mahmoud had spent most of the money he had extracted from his victims and possessed few assets that could be seized to provide restitution, though investigators did manage to freeze some bank accounts and recover a small percentage of the total amounts that had been stolen across all victims. The symbolic importance of any financial recovery exceeded its practical value for most victims, who recognized that they would never recoup the majority of their losses, but who valued the official recognition that they had been victims of criminal fraud, rather than simply having made poor romantic choices. The criminal trial of Mahmoud El-Sayed began in March 2024 in a Cairo courtroom, where international observers monitored proceedings to assess how seriously Egyptian authorities were treating romance scam cases involving foreign victims and whether cultural biases would prevent appropriate accountability for someone who had systematically defrauded women from multiple countries. The charges included fraud, obtaining money under false pretenses, and operating a criminal scheme, with prosecutors presenting evidence from 7 confirmed victims and arguing that Mahmoud's systematic approach across multiple years demonstrated calculated criminal enterprise rather than simply being someone who had made poor relationship choices or who had mismanaged his romantic life. The defense strategy attempted to portray Mahmoud as someone who had genuinely cared for multiple women simultaneously and who had been overwhelmed by the complexity of managing relationships with individuals from different cultures, arguing that providing money to someone you were romantically involved with did not constitute fraud simply because the relationship ultimately did not work out as planned. This narrative required ignoring the overwhelming evidence of deliberate deception, including Mahmoud's false representations about being single, his fabricated emergencies designed specifically to extract money, and his documented communications with other scammers about techniques for manipulating foreign women, making the defense arguments transparently inadequate for anyone who examined the actual evidence rather than accepting superficial characterization of the situation as complicated romance gone wrong. The testimony from Laura Bennett provided emotionally powerful account of how she had been systematically manipulated over 26 months through carefully calibrated emotional exploitation and financial extraction that had left her not only financially devastated but also psychologically traumatized in ways that would require years of therapy to address. Laura described the progression from initial friendly contact through romantic courtship to engagement and ongoing financial requests, emphasizing how each stage had been designed to deepen her emotional investment and make her less likely to question inconsistencies or refuse subsequent demands. Her testimony included specific examples of how Mahmoud had exploited her vulnerability following her divorce, her desire for passionate romantic connection she had never experienced in her marriage, and her hope that their relationship represented destiny rather than recognizing it as systematic predatory targeting. The testimony from Sandra Mueller corroborated Laura's account and established a clear pattern of identical manipulation tactics across multiple victims, with Sandra describing remarkably similar progression through the same stages of initial contact, romantic courtship, engagement, and systematic financial extraction that Laura had experienced. The consistency between their accounts, despite their having been targeted at different times and having had no contact with each other until their accidental simultaneous arrival at Mahmoud's apartment, demonstrated that his behavior was scripted systematic fraud rather than authentic relationships that had simply become complicated through his inability to manage multiple romantic interests simultaneously. The presentation of evidence from the other 5 identified victims through videotaped depositions or written statements further established the pattern of Mahmoud's romance scam operation, with each woman describing experiences that followed the same trajectory and that had resulted in similar financial losses and psychological trauma. The cumulative impact of hearing multiple victims describe nearly identical experiences was powerful demonstration that Mahmoud had been operating criminal enterprise specifically designed to exploit vulnerable women through sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation and emotional exploitation. The expert testimony about romance scam psychology provided the court with framework for understanding why intelligent, educated women could be deceived by someone like Mahmoud, explaining how predators specifically targeted individuals with particular vulnerabilities and how the manipulation techniques employed were designed to bypass rational judgment through exploitation of powerful emotional needs and desires. The expert emphasized that blaming victims for falling for sophisticated scams was both psychologically harmful and practically counterproductive, as it discouraged reporting and enabled continued victimization by creating culture of shame rather than accountability. The financial evidence presented by prosecutors included detailed accounting of money transfers, travel expenses, and gifts provided by victims, totaling over £300,000, equivalent across the 7 confirmed cases, and possibly more from additional victims who had not been identified or who had been too embarrassed to report their experiences to authorities. The documentation showed that Mahmoud had been living entirely from the proceeds of his romance scams, while maintaining false front of employment and financial stability that was crucial for his manipulation tactics. The evidence of Mahmoud's participation in networks, sharing romance scam techniques, and information about potential victims revealed that his criminal behavior was not isolated, but rather part of broader informal industry, where predators cooperated to identify vulnerable targets and share effective manipulation strategies. The WhatsApp group chat histories showed disturbing level of organization and callousness about the harm being inflicted on women who were discussed in dehumanizing instrumental terms, rather than being recognized as individuals whose lives were being devastated by systematic fraud. The defense's attempt to introduce evidence suggesting that the victims had willingly provided money and therefore could not claim fraud was effectively countered by prosecutors who demonstrated that the willingness had been obtained through deliberate misrepresentation about Mahmoud's intentions, his relationship status, and the purposes for which the money was being requested. The legal principle that fraud vitiated consent applied directly to Mahmoud's situation, where victims would never have provided money if they had known the truth about his multiple simultaneous relationships and his complete lack of genuine intention to marry any of the women he was systematically exploiting. The testimony from Amira Hassan about her experience as Mahmoud's local Egyptian fiancé provided cultural context about how he had weaponized his traditional engagement as cover for his romance scam operations, while simultaneously devastating her and her family when the truth emerged about his criminal activities. Amira's account added dimension to understanding how Mahmoud's crimes had harmed not only his foreign victims, but also local individuals whose associations with him had damaged their reputations and prospects in cultural context, where such scandals carried particularly severe social consequences. The closing arguments synthesized weeks of testimony and evidence into competing narratives, about whether Mahmoud was calculating criminal or simply someone who had made poor relationship choices, though the weight of evidence made the prosecution's characterization overwhelmingly more credible than the defense's attempts to minimize his systematic predatory behavior. The prosecutor emphasized that Mahmoud had deliberately targeted vulnerable women, had systematically deceived them through false representations, had extracted enormous sums through manufactured emergencies, and had threatened victims when they discovered his deception, all demonstrating consciousness of guilt and deliberate criminal intent rather than relationship complications that might deserve sympathy rather than punishment. The verdict in Mahmoud El-Sayed's trial was delivered on May 7, 2024, with the three-judge panel finding him guilty on all charges, including fraud, obtaining money under false pretenses, and operating a criminal scheme that had devastated multiple victims across several years. The conviction reflected the court's determination that the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated systematic predatory behavior rather than relationship complications, and that Mahmoud's actions warranted criminal punishment rather than being dismissed as private matters between individuals who had made poor romantic choices. The sentencing phase included victim impact statements from Laura, Sandra, and several other victims who described the comprehensive devastation Mahmoud's crimes had inflicted on their financial security, their psychological well-being, and their ability to trust anyone in subsequent relationships. The statements emphasized that Mahmoud had not simply taken their money, but had stolen their hope, their dignity, and their capacity for authentic connection by weaponizing their normal human desires for love and partnership against them through systematic manipulation, designed specifically to exploit their vulnerabilities. The sentence of 8 years imprisonment plus restitution orders represented significant accountability, though many victims felt it was insufficient given the scope of harm Mahmoud had inflicted across multiple years and numerous victims who would carry psychological scars for the remainder of their lives. The judge's statement accompanying the sentence emphasized that romance scams represented serious crimes, deserving substantial punishment, and that the court rejected any suggestion that victims should be blamed for trusting someone who had deliberately deceived them through sophisticated manipulation tactics specifically designed to exploit normal human emotional needs. The deportation order that would take effect following Mahmoud's prison sentence ensured that he would never be able to legally return to any European country where his victims resided, though the practical enforceability of such orders remained questionable given the challenges of international law enforcement cooperation and the possibility that Mahmoud might attempt to continue his scams from Egypt or other locations after completing his sentence. The symbolic importance of the deportation order exceeded its practical effect, representing official recognition that he was unwelcome in countries whose citizens he had systematically victimized. The civil judgments that followed the criminal conviction awarded damages to victims, though the practical reality was that Mahmoud possessed few assets and limited earning capacity, especially after spending years in prison, meaning that victims would likely recover only small fractions of their losses, despite having legal judgments in their favor. The limited financial recovery reflected the unfortunate reality that romance scam victims rarely recouped their losses, even when criminal convictions were obtained, though the symbolic validation of having their victimization officially recognized provided some psychological benefit that exceeded the modest financial compensation actually received. The media coverage following the conviction brought renewed attention to romance scam phenomenon and the particular vulnerabilities of middle-aged women seeking connection after divorces or relationship failures, with educational campaigns emphasizing warning signs of romance scams and encouraging anyone who suspected they were being manipulated to seek help from friends, family, or victim support organizations, rather than allowing shame to prevent them from escaping exploitation before financial and psychological damage became even more severe. The advocacy work that emerged from Laura's experience included her decision to speak publicly about her victimization, despite the embarrassment and judgment she knew would follow, determined that sharing her story might prevent other women from falling for similar scams by normalizing discussion of romance fraud and challenging victim-blaming narratives that made reporting difficult. Laura's advocacy emphasized that romance scam victims were not foolish or naive, but rather targets of sophisticated predatory behavior specifically designed to exploit universal human needs for love and connection that everyone possessed, regardless of intelligence or life experience. The support networks connecting victims of romance scams provided crucial mutual assistance as women who had been targeted by Mahmoud and similar predators worked together to process their trauma, challenge their self-blame, and rebuild their capacity for trust and authentic connection after experiencing systematic betrayal by someone who had presented himself as offering exactly what they had been desperately seeking. The solidarity among victims helped counter the isolation and shame that romance scam perpetrators relied upon to silence their targets and continue operating without accountability. The legislative changes inspired partially by Laura's case included enhanced laws in several European countries, specifically addressing romance scams and making it easier to prosecute cross-border fraud cases where victims and perpetrators were in different countries. Though the practical challenges of international law enforcement cooperation meant that many romance scammers continued operating with relative impunity, especially when targeting victims from countries with limited law enforcement, resources, or cultural attitudes that blamed women for their victimization. The educational initiatives developed in response to the case included specific programs targeting middle-aged divorced women about recognizing manipulation tactics and protecting themselves from romance scammers who specifically targeted their demographic, though the program struggled to balance, providing useful protective information with avoiding victim-blaming messages that might discourage women from seeking connection or might increase their shame if they did fall victim to scams, despite being aware of the risks. The recovery process for Laura Bennett extended far beyond the trial's conclusion, requiring years of intensive therapy to address not only the financial devastation, but also the profound psychological trauma of having been systematically manipulated by someone who had exploited her deepest vulnerabilities and desires for love and connection following her divorce. The shame that Laura initially felt about being deceived gradually transformed into recognition that she had been targeted by a sophisticated predator specifically because of her positive qualities, including her capacity for trust, her loyalty, and her desire to believe in love, rather than because of character flaws or poor judgment that victim-blaming narratives suggested. The relationship between Laura and her best friend Emily strengthened through the crisis, as Emily provided unwavering support despite her earlier warnings about Mahmoud having been ignored, demonstrating the kind of loyal friendship that sustained Laura through the darkest periods of processing her trauma and rebuilding her life after losing her entire divorce settlement to someone who had viewed her purely as source of income to be exploited. Emily's refusal to engage in judgment or recrimination helped Laura avoid the spiral of self-blame that might otherwise have prevented her recovery and her eventual ability to trust anyone again in romantic contexts. The financial recovery for Laura was limited, with only modest restitution received from seizure of Mahmoud's few assets, forcing her to rebuild her savings through continued work as dental hygienist while managing the credit card debt she had accumulated during the relationship. The financial stress was compounded by the reality that at age 47, Laura was starting over economically from a position worse than when she had divorced, having lost not only the settlement, but also 2 years of potential savings and financial progress that would have occurred if she had not been systematically defrauded by Mahmoud. The advocacy work Laura eventually undertook included speaking at fraud prevention conferences, participating in documentary projects about romance scams, and supporting other victims through online communities where women shared experiences and encouraged each other through recovery processes that were often lengthy and psychologically challenging. Laura's public advocacy helped normalize discussion of romance fraud and challenged cultural narratives that blamed victims for being naive or greedy, rather than recognizing them as targets of sophisticated criminal operations, designed specifically to exploit normal human emotional needs. The lasting impact of Laura's case on romance scam awareness included enhanced educational materials, warning about specific tactics that predators employed, improved reporting mechanisms for victims who might otherwise have been too embarrassed to seek help, and better coordination between international law enforcement agencies investigating cross-border fraud that exploited differences in legal systems and cultural attitudes to enable continued victimization with limited accountability. The relationship that Laura eventually developed with another survivor of romantic fraud represented her gradual rebuilding of capacity for trust and intimacy, despite the profound betrayal she had experienced, demonstrating that recovery was possible, though. It required conscious effort, therapeutic support, and patience, with the inevitable trust issues that emerged whenever she attempted to form authentic emotional connections after having been so systematically deceived by someone who had seemed to offer exactly what she had been seeking. The new relationship developed slowly over several years through a support group for fraud victims, built on foundations of radical honesty, shared understanding of trauma, and mutual commitment to healing, rather than rushing into romantic intensity that might replicate the overwhelming emotions that had made Laura vulnerable to Mahmoud's manipulation in the first place. The international cooperation that Laura's case helped establish between fraud investigation units across European countries and Egyptian authorities represented systemic improvement in how cross-border romance scams were investigated and prosecuted, though significant challenges remained in actually holding perpetrators accountable given the jurisdictional complexities and the limited resources many countries devoted to fraud cases that were sometimes dismissed as private matters, rather than serious crimes deserving comprehensive law enforcement response. The enhanced protocols included better information sharing about known romance scammers, standardized procedures for victims reporting cross-border fraud, and improved coordination for asset seizure and restitution collection that might at least partially compensate victims for their financial losses. The psychological research inspired by Laura's case and similar incidents contributed to enhanced understanding of how romance scammers identified and exploited specific vulnerabilities, why intelligent, educated women could be deceived by sophisticated manipulation tactics, and what factors promoted resilience and recovery among victims who had experienced systematic romantic fraud. The research emphasized that victimization reflected predators' sophisticated understanding of human psychology, rather than indicating any deficiency in victims' intelligence or judgment, helping to reduce stigma that prevented many people from reporting scams or seeking support after being targeted by criminals who specialized in exploiting normal human needs for love and connection. The educational initiatives developed through collaboration between victim advocates, law enforcement agencies, and mental health professionals provided comprehensive guidance about recognizing romance scam warning signs, including excessive flattery and rapid progression toward commitment, requests for money, especially for emergencies or travel expenses, reluctance to meet in person or to introduce romantic partners to friends and family, and inconsistencies in stories about life circumstances or reasons for needing financial assistance. The educational materials emphasized that anyone could potentially be targeted by romance scammers and that protecting oneself required maintaining healthy skepticism and conducting verification before making significant emotional, financial investments in relationships with people met online or while traveling. The technological solutions developed by social media platforms and dating services in response to cases like Laura's included enhanced identity verification procedures, improved reporting mechanisms for suspected romance scams, and algorithmic detection systems designed to identify patterns of behavior associated with fraudulent accounts targeting vulnerable users. The limitations of these technological approaches remained significant given the scale of platforms and the sophistication of scammers who continuously adapted their techniques to circumvent security measures, but the incremental improvements represented progress toward better protecting users from predatory criminals who weaponize social media and dating platforms to facilitate systematic fraud. The lasting legacy of Laura Bennett's story lives on through the enhanced awareness about romance scams that her public advocacy created, the improved investigative protocols and legal frameworks her case helped establish, the victims who found courage to report their experiences after hearing her story, and the potential victims who protected themselves by recognizing warning signs that Laura had learned to identify too late, but that she was now sharing to prevent others from experiencing similar devastation. Her transformation from victim to advocate represented the kind of resilience and determination that inspired others, while also demonstrating that recovery was possible even after experiencing systematic betrayal that had devastated every aspect of her life, including her finances, her emotional well-being, and her fundamental capacity to trust anyone in romantic contexts. Her story stands as permanent reminder that behind every romance scam statistic lies a real person whose life was devastated by deliberate, calculated fraud. That protecting vulnerable individuals requires challenging victim-blaming narratives and creating environments where reporting is encouraged rather than stigmatized, and that even the most painful experiences of betrayal and exploitation can ultimately be transformed into advocacy and education that prevents future victims from experiencing similar harm at the hands of predators who specialize in weaponizing love and hope against those who dare to believe in human connection and authentic romantic partnership in an age where online platforms have made it easier than ever for sophisticated criminals to identify, target, and systematically exploit vulnerable individuals across international boundaries, while often escaping accountability through jurisdictional complexities and cultural attitudes that sometimes blame victims for their own victimization, rather than holding perpetrators fully responsible for the deliberate harm they inflict through systematic predatory deception designed specifically to exploit universal human needs that everyone possesses, regardless of intelligence, education, or life experience.